All right, we are live. Well, not really live. Like I said, I'm just going to record this for editing later. All right, so this is an interview with my brother, Seth Eddy, who is astrophotography nerd, geek, or however you want to label it. He's very passionate about it. He's been doing it for quite a while. Here's some of his images that he's done recently. Yeah, I'm not sure how long he's been doing it, but so I do mostly Milky Way photography and don't really do much beyond that. So in this video, we're going to talk about how you can go to the next level and maybe take pictures of galaxies and stars and nebulas and various other astronomical or stellar objects that you find interesting. And we'll discuss a little bit about what his evolution was from starting with a Nikon D90 and then building up to what he has now, and he'll describe that here in a few minutes. Seth, describe a little bit about what your equipment is like now, what you use, and maybe a little bit of what, like, when you go out to take pictures, what that looks like as far as your workflow and some of your what the commitment is there, I guess.
So my commitment, so when I go out and do astrophotography these days, it's a lot of work because I live right by the coast, and so I've got to pack everything up in my car, and I've got to drive somewhere where the skies are clear. So if you're lucky enough to have skies that are relatively clear enough, probably like I have, it can be a little easier to just set up in your backyard and don't have to worry about carrying batteries and things like that. The system that I have now is it's evolved over the years. I've been doing this for, I guess, 3 or 4 years now. And I started out more wide field, so shorter focal length. And I've moved to a much longer focal length. I'm right around 2,000 millimeters. And so my system accounts for, I've got an equatorial mount made by Astrophysics, which is kind of, if you're going to get into more of the deeper sky stuff, nebulas and galaxies, you're going to need something that tracks. And depending on how serious you are and how narrow or how long your focal length is, basically your most important piece of gear will be the tracker if you're going really long like I am at 2,000 millimeters. So my mount is one of my most expensive pieces of gear, and then I've got a Ritchie Christian telescope. It's a 10-inch diameter, same kind of optical system as what's on Hubble. It's designed for a flat field, so you don't have field curvature. You have no chromatic aberration or things like that. It does have a little stigmatism sometimes. I mean, they're known for it maybe having astigmatism. But for the most part, they have a nice flat fields. The stars all the way to the corners are pinpoint, not oblong or anything like that. And then all the ancillary gear that goes along with those two things, including cameras, guide cameras, batteries to power everything, laptop computers, dew heaters, automatic focusers, and that's kind of all that stuff that I have. So that's what I use now.
So when you shoot, how long are you out over to, like in a night? How much of that time are you spent shooting and all that stuff?
Well, I have the system set up pretty well now. I've redesigned the scope setup so that it's made for travel. So my imaging telescope, the guide camera, the dew heaters, power distribution, all this stuff is all on the telescope, mounted permanently, essentially. And it goes into a really large, actually the largest Pelican case you can buy. And then, so all I've got to do is I bring the mount, I pull it out, I set it up, and then I go. So my actual imaging time is as long as the sky is dark, that's where I'm imaging. So by the time I'm set up, so it takes me about an hour to set up and probably half an hour to get everything set up and balanced and ready to go. and I wait for Polaris, use Polaris to polar align, and then do a quick drift align. Takes me about 20 minutes. So basically, when the sun sets, you've got about an hour before nautical twilight ends and the sky is actually dark. By the time the sky is actually dark, I'm ready to image. And then I image all night till nautical twilight hits, and then I wrap everything up and go home.
Are you active, like participating in the imaging, or are you sleeping in your car at the time and it's mostly automatic?
A little bit of both. So like what I tend to do, it depends on the target. So an equatorial mount, depending on what mount you have and whatever, once you transition across the zenith, so once you cross, once your mount goes over the top of the sky, it'll end up, if you go too far, it'll hit the mount. So you have to do what's called a flip. So you've got to move the telescope from one side of the mount to the other, and then it can continue to track all the way to the other horizon. And so depending on the target and where it is in the sky and what time that flip is, depends on when my activity level is. So I'm really active in the beginning, getting the telescope set up, getting it tracking well, guiding well, polar aligned, all that good stuff, getting the camera down to temperature, getting it synced with the sky software, and and then usually it's like I set up the program and it runs. It just takes pictures after picture after picture, rotates filters, does everything that I need to do until either I want to switch to a different target, or I need to do a polar, I need to do a pure flip, or it just gets foggy or whatever. So what I tend to do is I tend to get it set up, get it running, and then I like to, I have binoculars and I look at things in the sky, and I'm just, kind of checking stuff out. It's, binoculars are a great way to view the sky. And then I'll sleep in my car until I'll set an alarm for the pure flip, give myself about 30 minutes ahead of time before the flip is required, just for safety, so I don't damage my gear. I don't want it hitting the mount or anything. Making sure everything's good, get my target figured out, get the sequence set up. I do the pure flip, resync the software a little bit, because when you do a flip, sometimes where the telescope thinks it's pointed isn't exactly where it is pointed, so you align it on a star and then set the program up and run again. And then usually at that point, after I've done my pure flip, I'm out for the night. Like I take a nap, set an alarm for the probably either right at the usually right at the end of the dark skies, and then from there I start wrapping everything up and go home. Or if I'm there for 2 nights, I just close everything down and cover it up, and then whatever.
Gotcha. And so just for the audience is aware, so when the sun sets, it's still too bright out, and I've noticed this with taking pictures of the Milky Way. Mm-hmm. It's too bright for approximately, it seems like an hour or so after sunset. And I'm sure that varies with latitude, because I know that when I went higher up in latitude one time, I was taking pictures of the sunset, and it just seemed like the sunset lasted for like 3 hours. I got so tired, I actually ended up going to bed. Because like 11 o'clock at night, and the sun was still setting. But yeah, it seems like maybe an hour, and that's what you're talking about. You said nautical dark.
It's about an hour. So it's when the sun is below 18 degrees below the horizon, that's dark. So if you're further up north and it's summer, it's going to take a lot longer for the sun to get to that 18-degree level. But you're in the winter, you guys will have really long winter nights. So you might not get a lot of summer nights imaging, but your winter nights will have nice long nights. So 18 degrees is the secret. There's a couple websites you can look at that'll tell you when each day, when nautical twilight ends, and you can find that pretty easily online.
All right. And then so I'm going to share some photos right now of what my brother takes pictures of with this equipment. So you can see that as we're talking for the next, couple of seconds or whatever. But what are some of your favorite, you call them targets, stellar objects? What are some of your favorites?
Well, right now, since I've got a longer focal length, I like to take the bigger targets that people, a good length that people image at is somewhere between 3 and 600 millimeters, 3 and 800 millimeters. So they have a wider field of view of the sky, and they can get like full targets, maybe the Sol Nebula or Heart Nebula. These are things that are larger than the moon in the sky, but are dimmer, so you can't see them, but they're massive. These structures can be huge across the sky. In fact, some of them are entire constellations. Like if you take Orion, for instance, Orion is this massive complex of hydrogen gas and stars, and it's if you were to take it with a 50 millimeter lens, you could capture, this big red arc, the Barnard's Loop. You could catch the Horsehead Nebula and all the local nebulas next to it. M78, which is this really great kind of diffuse reflective nebula, and then the entire Orion complex. So for me, I like to take pictures of these larger targets, but I like to pick interesting like clouds of hydrogen gas, or I like to zoom in on the higher detail stuff and kind of, you can kind of frame your image a little more. You have a little more artistic freedom, kind of, so to speak. Whereas if you cut off whole part of Orion constellation, it's just not going to look right with the way everything's kind of put together. So I do that, and then I also like doing some of the smaller galaxies that are kind of they're interacting. So maybe like a polar ring galaxies where the galaxy is interacted with another one, and the outside of the galaxy is spun to the core. So have these interesting shapes. Some of them are S-shaped, or they look like they're throwing dust off into space. I like those a lot. Those are a lot of fun. So yeah.
Cool. So let's, for the people when you're just getting started into this, let's say you've taken some Milky Way shots, which are fairly easy. These are 30-second exposures.
Mm-hmm.
At ISO, I shoot at 1600, 3200. So now you're thinking about getting a tracker. So I see some trackers for about $300, and let's say you have somewhere between 100 to a 200 millimeter lens. Like what? So explain
that'll capture most things. I mean, one of the larger targets in the sky is Andromeda. As far as a single target, not a complex of nebulas and things. Andromeda is huge. It's like 5 full moon diameters across. It's the closest galaxy to us. But even with a 180 millimeter lens, you've got room to spare. So you could zoom in, for instance, I think with a standard crop sensor, you could probably catch most of Andromeda at about 300 millimeters, pretty much all of it. So you'll still be, if you're at like 200, anything under 200 millimeters is still going to be a really wide field, but the tracker will be necessary at that point, because you'll be zoomed in enough. The sky moves 15 degrees an hour, and so it's very noticeable from image to image, the movement of the sky. And so without a tracker at anything over, and probably 25 millimeters or something like that, I'd be pretty tough to hide the star trails.
Yeah, a lot of people comment on mine, asking how I shoot at 30 seconds exposure lengths. They say, well, aren't you getting star trails and all that? And it's like, well, I'm shooting at like 14 millimeters, so it's,
yeah.
I mean, I am. At the corners, you can see it more, but you're not really going to see it too much. And so the star tracker, there's like one for about $300, and that's what you're talking about. So I'm going to post a link.
There's a couple of them, yeah.
Explain a little bit about, okay, so somebody buys a star tracker, and they have a lens. Let's say it's a 200 millimeter lens on their camera, or some zoom lens. How would you set that up? Like, just to give them an idea of like what that might look like. You get a tripod, so you have a tripod, and then you have to put the star tracker on the tripod. Let's just assume that they got that part figured out. They go out, it's the middle of the night. What do they do?
So they're all a little different, but essentially what you have to do is you've got to align the axis of rotation of your tracker to the axis of the Earth's rotation. So you have to make that parallel. And so the sky tracker isn't using a computer or anything. It's a clock. It's just moving the camera at 15 degrees an hour across the sky. And it's just replacing the rotation of the Earth with the rotation of the camera. So the camera is essentially pointing at the same target. So in order to do that, most of them have what's called a polar scope. And they usually use Polaris because it's so close to the center of the Earth's rotation. They'll use that as a target to lock in on. You use that to, usually there'll be like a little reticle that'll show the Big Dipper and Cassiopeia, which are kind of opposed from each other to orient the polar scope. And then it'll say, put Polaris in this circle here with Cassiopeia or Big Dipper here and here, right? Others will use 3-star alignment, so they'll use Polaris, which will have one location, and then there'll be 2 other stars, and you got to get all 3 of them on their spot. And when you do that, you're pretty close to polar line. They all have their own little, they're all their own little. Each polar scope has its own little method of doing it, but essentially you'll look through a polar scope or something like it. You'll align the mount, and what you'll have to do is you'll have to adjust the altitude and azimuth, so the altitude will be basically what your latitude is, and the azimuth will just be your east and west direction to get you lined up with the polar sky, with the polar axis. From there, and the longer your focal length, the more accurately you'll need to do that. And from there, if you've got a longer focal length, you may have to do something called a drift align, where you would, once you do, you align the scope. And if you really want to do long exposure and you're just using a tracker without any guiding, you might have to like point your camera like one direction and center it on something really bright, and then take an image and just watch it and see which way it drifts, and then make some adjustments to help increase the length. Most people won't need to do that. If you're at 200 millimeters or more, you probably need some sort of form of that, or you have to shorten your exposure lengths. If you're at anything, I'd say 100 or less, a tracker is probably, you're not going to need that. The polar scope will allow you to accurately enough to set up the the tracking to the rotation of the Earth, and you should be able to take 5-minute images or whatever around there. But this all varies a little bit depending on your camera and the size of the pixels that are in that camera and a couple other things. But generally, shorter your focal length, the easier you'll have tracking. The longer your focal length, the harder things get. So it's kind of an exponential curve.
Somebody with like a 200 millimeter lens, I think that's going to be kind of a standard one. A lot of people here might ask about like a kit lens that might be like a 18 to 200 millimeter, or some zoom lens of some sort. How good or bad are those to use? Because you're going to be looking at what, a f5.6 or something like that on those things.
Well, I guess it really depends on what you're trying to capture. So the faster the lens, the dimmer the thing you're going to be able to get, and that means not only light pollution, but also if you're pointed at the Milky Way and you're in a dark location and you want to do, if you're at f2.8 or something, you're going to capture a lot more of the faint detail and the wispy kind of reflective hydrogen that's in our galaxy and dust than you are going to if you're like 4 or 5.6 or something like that. So you can definitely start out with a kit lens. The issues will be like zoom shifting due to the rotation of the camera, and then getting out of focus because of that. Or so I mean, they all have their challenges, but I would recommend the fastest lens you can get.
So let's say they get like a 200 millimeter f2.8 lens. Mm-hmm. Then so what would be some of the targets you think would be pretty, with the introductory tracker? What do you think?
Well, I think most people would like to. I mean, the classic target. Almost everybody's favorite targets are in the Orion area. So it's going to be Horsehead Nebula, Orion. So with 180, 200 millimeter lens, you'll capture the Orion complex pretty well, which is, so if you're looking at the Orion's belt, most people know what that looks like. Orion rises with his back to the ground, and his the lowest star on that is the Horsehead Nebula. And then the sword is actually the Orion Nebula. So you can capture all of that with 180, 200 millimeters, no problem.
And they're pretty easy to identify too. I mean, like the Orion Nebula, luckily, is like, oh, there it is.
Easy to find. And then you can take a 10-second exposure and you'll see it, right? So it's not going to be, you can take a 10-second exposure just to work on framing and everything. So that's a really good target to start with. And then around there too, you've got the Rosette Nebula and the Christmas tree. There's a complex, I don't remember exactly, but there's like the Christmas tree nebula, Foxfire Nebula. They're all in one area. That's a great target. It's a little dim. You'd probably want to be in a not so light polluted area to try that one. Rosette Nebula is really bright. And then later, during a different time of the year, at the Southern Cross in Cygnus, there's the North American Nebula would be a great target for that. The North American Nebula, also right next to it, is got the Pelican Nebula. That's a really bright. It's a really bright nebula. Lots of hydrogen gas. You'll get more detail if you modify your camera to go, into the infrared a little more, but it still works without a modified camera. And then the other one I would recommend is Andromeda, just because, it's a galaxy that's just massive and gorgeous, and it's a great target.
Just to geek out a little bit, explain to how you can tell when with like a hydrogen nebula versus how do you know it's hydrogen gas? I think that's pretty interesting how you can tell that.
The color. So hydrogen gas, if you get really far into it, you can actually, people use a form of filters. They use what they call narrowband imaging. They use narrowband filters, and they actually single out specific gases and the wavelength that they give off when they cool from a certain phase to a certain phase. So, for instance, hydrogen releases the hydrogen alpha band, which is, I think, is 653 or somewhere around there. Nanometers is the wavelength. When it cools from the 5th valence shell to the 3rd valence shell. So when hydrogen gets heated up by something like a star nearby and it cools off by releasing a photon of a specific wavelength. And so people tune their cameras using filters to capture only that specific wavelength, and that filters out all of the light pollution and allows them to get great images without having to worry about the light pollution in their area. So they can take 30-minute, an hour, 2-hour exposure. Not that most people do that, but as long as you really want it, and all you'd really be capturing is hydrogen gas and stars that are releasing, of course, the broad spectrum. So you'll pick up some starlight and hydrogen cooling off. So they also use there's also oxygen and other things that people pick up. So hydrogen, you'll know it because it's a red. It releases in the red wavelength. The most abundant thing in the universe is hydrogen, as far as elements. So most of the gas out there is hydrogen, and then you pick up other things like oxygen, what have you, and those are the other gases that people tend to pick up.
Cool. Actually, talking about exposure length, you were mentioning. So you have a 200 millimeter lens or 180 millimeter f2.8 lens. And the reason my brother keeps saying 180 millimeter f2.8 lens is because that's one that he has and had for his Nikon D90. And so we use that, I think, in the beginning when we first started. What kind of what exposure lengths are you looking at to do the Andromeda and maybe the Horsehead Nebula? And just to give you an example, these are pictures of the Horsehead Nebula and the Andromeda Galaxy that Seth took.
The exposure length will greatly depend on where you are, and what I mean is the light pollution is the limiting factor. If you are in the darkest place out there, you'll expose you'll expose to the right of your histogram, right? But you can't do that. I mean, you can't really do that in a light polluted area because all you'll end up with is a white image. Because the reflection of the city lights off the atmosphere, they create essentially like that's anything dimmer than that you won't pick up. Does that make so? You're what you have to do is shoot to essentially what you do is you shoot with the histogram, where you try and just bump off the left hand side of the histogram by maybe a third. That's what I used to try and do. So you try and have nothing falling off the left hand side because the targets are so dim. You're trying to break the read noise barrier. So if the majority of your data is black or more, if the majority of your sensor exposure is black, then the majority of your data is read noise, which means it's going to be hard to even stacking to get the detail out of what you want. So you need to get off the left-hand side of the histogram at least a little bit, and that'll depend on, there's some places you can do some calculations, get really nerdy on it if you want, but I just recommend with a DSLR, get off the left-hand side, maybe a third of the way across if you can without whitening out your image. Otherwise, just get as far off of that left-hand side as you can, even just a little bit with the left of your histogram to break that read noise. And then if you're going to be stacking, take as many as you can. It's actually the detail, it's kind of weird, but the detail you gain from the one image will be, it can be multiplied. If you take a bunch of 90-second exposures, you'll look at that 90-second exposure and you might not have much there, but you stack 200 of them together and you'll be surprised at what shows up. If I would, it's a kind of a trial and error in the beginning. And what you're going to want to do is take the longest exposure you can and without having star trails. First of all, pinpoint stars are going to be really important because if the stars are trailing, your target is also trailing. So you'll have a blurry, low detail.
Even with the tracker, you're saying?
No, so a tracker won't track an hour. You can't do an hour exposure with a tracker. There's just no way. You'll have field rotation and all kinds of stuff.
Yeah.
Because it's not tracking perfectly. But you want to take the longest exposure you can without having any noticeable error in your tracking. And then so if you're limited by sky, if you're tracking better than you can, if the sky is whiting out before you're getting star trails, your limiting factor is not your tracking, it's your sky, it's the quality of your sky. So then you move back to tracking's great. Now my limiting factor is the brightness of my sky, and then you reduce your exposure length based on on that. So then you'll shorten it so that you can still see your target essentially. Yeah.
Gotcha. Do you get a pretty nice usable image shooting? Like, let's say your 200 millimeter lens f2.8. Let's just say the Andromeda Galaxy, 90-second exposure, one exposure. Would you get an image that's decent just off of that?
If you are in a dark area, yeah, you could probably get something that's usable. If you might go a little longer, maybe 2 minutes would be a good image for there. I've done 5-minute exposures of Andromeda Galaxy, and I stacked 6 of them, but I didn't need to because they were just so clean because I was in a really dark sky. So you can get something you'd be really happy with. Yeah, Andromeda's bright. If you've got a lot of sky pollution, probably not. You'll most likely need to take short exposures and stack.
Gotcha. And that's one of the benefits of the short exposures. You can do it in a dirtier area of light versus having to find like pure dark. How is it out? Just to give people an idea, you're shooting. I mean, you live in Central Coast of California, right near Monterey.
Mm-hmm.
You drive out to the Pinnacles, which is 30 or an hour or so.
About an hour.
Yep. And then how good is the sky out there?
So where I live here, it's suburban yellow orange. So you can look at the sky maps. It's pretty blown out. The Pinnacles is like it's a rural or semi-dark site. It's pretty dark. I don't remember what the scale is. It's probably like a 3 or something like that. I image in like a 6 or a 7, and the Pinnacles is like a 3 or a 2, and so it's pretty dark. Um, then I go to another place, which is it's about as dark as it gets. I go to another place. It's 2 hours away, east of King City, and it's like a 1 or something. It's super dark.
Cool. Cool. Where do you go out there? Is it a park or is it a friend's house or something?
It's a BLM land called Laguna Mountain.
Okay.
And that's free. They have campsites, free campsites, and it's a little higher in altitude, so it's about 3,500 feet. So less atmospheric disturbance to deal with, just because of less atmosphere, and it's less humidity. So not shooting through thicker air. Pinnacles tends to be pretty humid, especially as you creep into the morning, early morning. So if I can, I go out to Laguna Mountain just because it's another hour, but the quality of sky, even though, I mean, you're already going to a dark site, why not go to a really good dark site?
Yeah, exactly.
You can do it anyway. Yeah. And then I image from here a lot, but I tend to nowadays, I don't really do a lot of color for my house. I just do narrowband data. So it's just black and white, and it's all mostly hydrogen alpha and really long exposures, 15 to 20-minute exposures.
Okay, and that's what you posted just recently. Of the I think it was the Horsehead Nebula.
You did a Horsehead and then a Sol Nebula close up. Yeah, those are both hydrogen alpha.
Okay, cool. Yeah, and those are black and white. And then so you talk about stacking a lot. Just to explain to people a little bit of what stacking is, so that they have an idea.
Okay, so stacking is a process to essentially its main goal is to reduce the noise by increasing your signal to noise ratio. So the way it works is if you were able to take a picture of the same target over and over and over and over and over again, and so each pixel represented the exact portion of the sky as every other pixel, then you could run the data across, like, if nothing's changing, like you're taking a picture of a white wall, or like maybe a gray card, right? Taking a picture of a gray card.
I have a cat crawling up onto the onto the computer. It's about to step right over the computer.
So if you're taking a picture of a gray card, right, it's the same across the whole screen. And if you were to compare each pixel from multiple exposures, you'd notice differences in the pixel values. Some of them will be hot pixels, some of them will be read noise, and the value will change, or it can even be lighting can be different across the grayscale, right? So what you're trying to do essentially is you're trying to capture the real, like, figure out what the actual quality of that part of the sky is. And so you'll use a bunch of images of the same part of the sky, and you don't have to be tracking perfectly, because what the software does is it locates the stars and the centroids of the stars. So and then it aligns every single image up over those centroids. So you're basically, each pixel or each section of the sky is being compared to the same section of sky. So it might be one pixel, way over here is looking at the same part of the sky as a pixel way over here, but then the software lines them up. So you're comparing the same part of the sky to the same part of the sky. And then you run a bunch of numbers to make sure that you don't have hot pixels, that there's either there could be like a gamma ray burst, a gamma ray could have hit your sensor, or one of many issues could have happened, right? Also, it helps get rid of the, what do they call it? Dark current noise. So that's actually, you take a 30-second exposure and your sensor's got basically electricity running through it, and the longer it's got electricity running through it, it gets warmer. And sometimes though that heat heats up the silicon enough to create an electron, which gets read as light, right? So all of this stuff kind of there are forms of noise that this stacking process uses to get rid of it. And then not only do you add your lights to the stacking process, but then you can add calibration frames. You can take your telescope or your lens and you can point it at a flat, evenly illuminated screen. Like, I actually used to use a monitor for a computer with just a white screen, and then you image that, and then that'll get rid of vignetting. The software will update. It'll correct for vignetting. It'll correct for dust on the sensor, dust on the lens, and then you can also do things like bias frames, where you're taking with lens cap on, the shortest exposure your camera can do, and what it actually, you basically are taking a picture of the quality of your sensor. And so it'll show column defects, read noise issues, whatever. And you take hundreds of those, and then it'll stack a master that'll show how your sensor actually reads the data and the errors that it has in there. And then it'll subtract and modify your sensors from that. And then you can also do dark frames, which get rid of things like hot pixels and gamma ray bursts and satellites tracking across your image. And if you calibrate with all that stuff together, you can end up with a really nice, clean, low noise image.
Gotcha. Interesting. Very interesting. So, I mean, I want to try to paraphrase exactly what you said. Basically, what the software does is you can calibrate your camera and it can see where your camera has bad pixels, but also it's basically looking at each individual pixel, and you stack, let's say 30 images or 100 images. I don't know what the normal stack is. And some of those pixels will be hot, some of them will be cold, some of them will be, and it'll know like, okay, this is what the color should be
Yep.
on the average of all of these images that you've taken. So it helps to get rid of noise that you might be experiencing, just even though you might not be using a high ISO or particularly high ISO, you're still going to experience some noise in the camera. And this helps to get rid of all of that because you're looking at very individual specks of light. It helps to clean it all up, right? It's basically.
Yeah. And one thing that most people, especially, they tend to move into this from photography. And so they're used to taking pictures of things during the day. And you don't have a lot of read noise issues during the day because there's more than enough signal to balance out the read noise. When you're taking pictures of things that are 4 million or 40 million light years away, there's not a lot of light hitting your sensor. That light gets dispersed over 40 million light years of distance, and you might only get a photon strike from the target once every 5 seconds. So you're getting a little bit of data on that one photon, on that one sensor. So, your sensor's got to, depending on how sensitive it is, it has a percentile chance, it's got a quantum efficiency. So that photon, if it hits your sensor, it might have a 60% chance of even creating an electron that you read as data, real data. So if you've got, you're essentially shooting these long exposures, but all your data is the very left-hand side of your histogram. And then you've got to stretch that out. You've got to basically clip all that data to the right on your histogram because there's no information there except maybe the centers of your stars. And then you've got to stretch out this little teeny sliver that just looks like a line on the left side of your histogram. And you got to turn that into a histogram that you recognize as like your whole data. And when you do that, that 8 to 12 electrons of read noise per pixel becomes a substantial portion of your data. And so that's what you're trying to get. Read noise is one of the bigger things you're trying to get rid of. It's not the noise doesn't show up so much in the target. It happens in the background, in the black part of the sky that you don't, the darker parts of the target, like the actual space. So what you'll end up with is sometimes the target will look great, but everything else just looks grainy and nasty because there's all this read noise, and it's hard to get rid of. So that's part of what you're trying to get rid of too, is all that read noise. And it's the dark parts of your target that start looking grainy and nasty. The brighter portions, the centers of the galaxies, the centers of the clusters or whatever, those tend to image fairly well. And the read noise gets, there's enough data there, signal to noise, that it's not an issue with too much noise there. But it's the fringes, which that's what makes the target, is when you get all the smaller data, all the dimmer stuff.
Gotcha. Cool. The what kind of, so obviously you go out in the middle of the night and you're going to take pictures of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
As a new astrophotographer, even now becoming like a semi-amateur astronomer, almost at the same token. What do you use software or like an app on your phone to help identify where objects are in the sky?
Yeah, I mean, there's, I think it's called this, what do I use? Sky Safari is like the best as far as using it out with your phone. it's Android and iOS, and you can use it. It's like an augmented reality thing. So you point the camera at the sky, and it knows what you're looking at. Essentially, it uses your GPS and that kind of stuff. So that's one good way to do it. There's another for your computer. There's a free planetarium software called Stellarium. And it actually, that's the software I use to control my telescope. It's a great software. It can control pretty much any kind of telescope. But it also has things where you can input a sensor size, so the dimensions of your sensor. You can input the focal length of your lens, and then you can select a target and then zoom in, and it'll show you what your field of view will be if you want to take a picture of it.
That's really handy. So you can kind of almost like you can almost simulate what you're going to take a picture of. So even a new photographer could estimate what they're going to see. So Stellarium, you said, is free.
Stellarium is free. Yep. And it's a great software for just looking at stuff on your computer. You get a good idea of what the sky looks like, how it rotates, where the constellations are. You can filter out things like you want to take a picture of a galaxy of a certain size, or of a nebula of a certain size, or whatever. If you were looking to take a picture of a globular cluster, you could just look for globular clusters and see what it'll look like on your sensor with your setup. Another really good target, or if I was going to say the three tools for figuring out what you want to look at and how to image, would be Stellarium. It allows you to see what's going to come up, when it's going to be up in the sky, how high it's going to get, all that kind of stuff, and you can visualize it. DSO Browser, Deep Sky Object Browser, is a website you can use too. It's a great site for showing, it's a lot of filters. You can do the same thing where you can put in your sensor size and focal length, and it'll have a screening of the target. It has a good database of actual target images. So when you do that, say, what does it look like on like Orion Nebula, say, what does Orion Nebula look like with my focal length and my sensor size? And then it'll have an actual image that someone took of Orion Nebula, and there'll be a box around it showing you basically how big it will be in your sensor. But it also gives you rise time, transit times, allows you to mark things as targets you want to see. It'll send you reminders like this target's coming up or whatever. And so it allows you to kind of plan your night a little better. And then there's a website called Astrobin, which is like, it's kind of like Instagram, but the only thing on it are astrophotography pictures. And that's a good website just so you can look at people with your similar, as you progress, you filter out people with 24 millimeter lenses using a Nikon or a Canon, whatever, 55D. And then you can see what they'll put in the data, how many pictures they took, how long the pictures were, the darkness of their sky, what day they took the pictures on, if they used any filters, what their mount was, all this stuff. And then it gives you an idea of, like, you can see what people take pictures of, and you can go, oh, I want to take pictures like this. What equipment did they use? And then you can see what equipment they used and what they were able to produce with that equipment. And it gives you a good idea of what's possible and what people are doing. And it lets you know how good you're doing, kind of. If you see a bunch of guys out there with your same gear and they're taking images that are way worse than you, you're doing a good job. If you see people with the same gear and they're taking pictures that are way better than you, then you're obviously missing something. And you can ask them what they're doing differently. And it's a great website.
Cool. Well, I'll put those links in the description below so that they're accessible, along with the links for some of the equipment that we're talking about. So that'd be the Sky Tracker, at least a couple options for that. And I think that starts in about the $300 price range, just so that people has an idea of what's involved there financially, like commitment. And then the tracking software, I forgot to ask you which one you use. I know, or not the tracking, the stacking software. I know it's free. Which one do you use?
Well, I have two. One is free. It's called, what is it? Deep Sky Stacker, DSS, Deep Sky Stacker. Super simple. It's a very small little program. You just grab the files from your directory, just drag them in, drop them. It asks you what type of file it is. You can add darks and flats and bias and whatever you want to it just the same way. And it's a pretty easy process or stacking program. So Deep Sky Stacker is what I use. And then there's another program called PixInsight, but I don't recommend that, especially if you're beginning. It's a great, it's like image processing software specifically for astrophotography. So it stacks, it does all of the image processing, background calibration, RGB combination, like what put black and white images together into color and all this other stuff. But it's not a very intuitive workflow. Most people are used to something like a Photoshop as to how you process an image, and this is nothing like that. So you can do that, but I'd stick with Deep Sky Stacker for now.
And you, for your post-processing, you do use Photoshop and stuff, and then you just buy, was it $10 a month subscription fee for Photoshop and Lightroom? Is that correct?
Yeah. I bought that PixInsight program, and it's nice for certain things, like maybe combining multiple, like if I'm shooting red, green, blue data and I'm putting it together in a color image, it's pretty efficient at that. But I feel like everything that software can do, I can do in half the time in Photoshop. So I pretty much use Deep Sky Stacker and Photoshop. Those are the two processing software, pieces of software I use. Photoshop is really powerful. It's a great
yeah, definitely. And I'm not going to get too much into the post-processing at the moment. I think, just getting people up and, at least figuring out what they need just to get started. So just to kind of recap in that regard. So you get, so you have your camera. If you ideally having some sort of, I guess it doesn't really matter lens size, even a 50 millimeter, you're saying you could start with some astrophotography. So like a nice high ISO, or not high ISO, a very fast lens, so like a f1.8, f1.4, 50 millimeter lens would be you could start with that. A lot of people have that. Going up from beyond that, you can get up to like a 200 millimeter lens. F2.8 is something that a lot of people would have or want to get, for some sports photography. So then also the tracker. So that's the hardware piece that mounts onto the tripod. So you have your tripod, you get your tracker, you mount your camera, you align it. Like you said, usually polar alignment.
And I'd use an intervalometer too. Intervalometer.
Okay. Yep. All right. Some of those are built into the cameras. If not, you can get them for cheap. I think I bought mine for like $5 or $6 on Amazon or something like that.
I recommend the ones, if you can. There's the wireless ones where the controller isn't wired to the actual controller for your camera if it's not one that's built into your camera, because then you don't have to like worry about the cable dragging and causing tracking issues or vibrations, and you can stop and start your imaging without having to be like super close to your camera. Right.
Good suggestion. Yep. Okay. And then just what an intervalometer is, I'll just tell people in case they don't know. But basically, it's a timer to tell the camera to take a picture. So it's like a shutter release cable, but this one has a timer built in so that you can take a 5-second exposure every 7 seconds or something like that. You can. So I've used it for the time lapse stuff. If it's not built into the camera, I'll take 30-second exposures every 35 seconds. And the reason it's every 35 is because I need about 5-second interval between the camera closing the shutter, processing, and then being set up to take the next shot without accidentally tripping up itself. So that's what I've done on my D300 and D600. That was built into the camera, but on my D3300 and 3100, that's not built into the camera. So I get an intervalometer attachment there. But that pretty much covers the equipment then, right, Seth? Just to get started.
Yeah, pretty much to get started. I mean, really to get started, all you need is a really wide field camera, and you can do stacking with static images. You don't have to be tracking the stack. The software will line up the images. I mean, you can't do, you can't point your camera in one spot all night and take images, but if what it'll do, you can take lots of images with a wide field, just pointed kind of straight up, stack them, and you can, you know,
You get some.
get some nice images that way. You can start right off just doing that, and you use a lot of the you know, you can do stacking and adjust, figure out, you know, exposure times, and you can capture pretty much anything. And then if you get into longer, then yeah, you'll need some tracking and things like that. And
I might have to give that a try, actually. Just
yeah,
get out here and take some pictures, see if I can get anything of the Andromeda, and that, I mean, and maybe the Horsehead Nebula and stuff like that. Though I don't know how much detail the Horsehead Nebula you could see, but at least, or the Orion Nebula, I should say.
Yeah, you'll see it. I mean, it's huge. It's bigger than the moon. So
That's sad. And then I don't think people realize it because it's so dim, you just can't see it. So you're saying the Andromeda Nebula. Go ahead. You're saying the Andromeda Nebula was like 5 full moon,
like 4 or 5 full moon. So it's like 3 degrees, and the moon is half a degree. The Orion Nebula is like the size of your fist in the sky almost. Sorry, not the Orion, Andromeda. Andromeda is like, it's big. It's a big piece of the sky, but again, it's actually the furthest the human eye can see. So you can actually see it. You can see Andromeda's core naked eye, in not even a super dark location. If you look at it, it's easier to look just slightly away from it. But
yeah, because you're gonna have that blind spot in the center of your eye, right? So you always kind of like look just slightly off.
And you pick it up with more of the cones, which are more sensitive to the dimmer light, right? Or not? No, the black and white receptors, not the cones. The
rods.
Yeah.
Rods and cones in your eyes.
But it's a big target. Yeah, some of the stuff is big. Like I said, most of the stuff you think of, you know, the moon is half a degree across, and you know, a lot of these targets, a lot of the larger nebulas or nebula complexes are a degree across. You know, so 2 moons.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. I think a lot of people get disappointed when they try to take pictures of the moon, and then they see it so large, and then when they take a picture, it's like tiny, little, just a little pinprick.
And so even, I mean, with a crop sensor, so one like a Nikon DX format camera, 700 millimeters is what you need to get basically the moon as big as it can get in the frame. So it's a pretty serious zoom to zoom into the moon all the way. You get some great the moon's easy to image too. I mean, you get some great images of the moon if you can get up above 200 millimeters. If you've got a 300, 400, 500 millimeter lens, you don't need to track for that. It's about as bright as it gets. We didn't talk about planetary, but planetary is a totally different type of imaging. Some people really like that, but again, you need a totally different setup than what I said. You would need to get long focal length, high focal ratio. So you're looking for like an f11, most likely, because you're looking for crisp focal.
Very sharp focus.
Very sharp focus, and then you're taking, and the objects you're going to be imaging would be the moon, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. Those tend to be the images that people image with on planetary stuff. And what you're actually looking for is you're taking, like, they use essentially video cameras, CMOS cameras, and you can do it with DSLRs that have like a video function, and you can basically take video, and it's like 100 frames a second or 60 frames, whatever you can do for whatever your camera is capable of. And what you're looking for is the best possible seeing. So it's like being at the bottom of a swimming pool looking up, and someone had just got out of the pool a little while ago, and sometimes what you're looking at will be nice and clear, and sometimes there'll be a wave going over it and it'll be all distorted. And so what you'll do is you'll use software to select the clearest of the images of your target, and then it'll take maybe 300 images out of 1,000,000 and stack those 300 together and throw away all the rest. And you get some really amazing images that way. People do some great stuff with, the banding, and absolutely clear as day, the giant red spot on Jupiter, or the rings of Saturn and the band. You can see people capture the 6-sided polar region of Saturn from Earth with just a regular telescope. So pretty cool stuff too.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really nerdy what needs to be done in order to get really good photos, but it can be really rewarding.
Yeah, it can be really rewarding. I mean, it's not it's a pretty complicated form of you have to like, you know, learning why things are happening and figure out, you know, like figuring out how to make what you want happen. You know, either trial and error or studying things and looking up why things happen or whatever. Because you know, it's not so bad at wide field deep sky, you know, wide field imaging with a 20 or 16 millimeter lens. Get some really gorgeous stuff with some nice foreground. You know, you can have a nice tree or something or whatever in the foreground, or some, you know, whatever mountains. That's not hard to do. But once you start getting, like I said, the longer your focal length gets, it's an exponential curve of difficulty. You get up to 2,000 millimeters like me, and it's serious investment with time and money, and, you know, lots of trial and error and learning things. And if I go to 4,000 millimeters, it's even harder to do because things get heavier and they get harder to balance and all that kind of stuff. So
you need a bigger vehicle.
Vehicle, yeah, or just a house in the middle of nowhere, yeah.
Yeah, yep, sounds good.
Yeah.
All right.
And there's one other thing I would recommend too, if you do get further along. So, you know, you start off with just taking single images. Maybe they get an intervalometer. And if you really get serious, where you get a star tracker and you're taking a lot of images, you know, you might look at investing in a program called Backyard EOS or Backyard Nikon. They're same company. They make one for Canon and one for Nikon cameras. And it's a camera control software that allows you to it helps you focus. You can access the little live view mode and you can view it right on your computer. You can control your camera right through your computer too. So you can set up imaging sequences, adjust the ISO, the shutter speed, and then it takes all that data. It allows you to live view them. You can take an image, view the image on your computer, zoom in a little bit, kind of do a quick stretch of the histogram to see whether you're capturing data or not. And then it saves all that data right onto your computer as opposed to having to download it off an SD card later or something. And it's only like $50. It's a great piece of software.
Cool. So I think that pretty much covers everything. I mean, is there anything? We didn't get any questions. You know, I set up a video a few weeks ago asking people if they had any questions. Didn't get anything there, but I did get some positive feedback that sounded like people were interested in this interview, so that's good. Is there anything that you think that I forgot to cover, or, you know, want to just kind of cover, you know?
No, I think that the thing, there are some astro cameras out there which you might cover. Nikon makes the 810A, and Canon makes I think it's the 60A now, that are pre-modified for astrophotography, meaning so they have an intervalometer built in.
Yeah, you're talking the D810E, I think, is that right, or something like that, where it has the
810A.
Okay.
A for Astro.
Okay.
And it's they have the filter in front. So there's a filter. Most cameras have a filter. Actually, pretty much all cameras have a filter that filters out the infrared and UV. And so for me, when I started with my Nikon, I started with a Nikon D90. I took my camera apart and took the filters out, and that allows you to get a little more detail out of that hydrogen, which is, again, it's like the most abundant thing. So some cameras you can buy that have those already, or you can do what I did, which is take the filter out. Do that at your own risk. I'm not saying you should do it, but if you do it, you know, you can either put in a clear filter that allows you to use lenses still, like a regular Nikon lenses or what have you. If you don't do that, the focal point changes. So some of the lenses they won't come to focus on your sensor anymore. So, or you can send your camera off and have it modified. So those are things you can do. That's a good thing. That's another step that someone might take after they start taking images as a deep sky. And then, yeah, it's fun. It's a really great, more and more people are doing it. And the technology, is getting better and cheaper and easier to use. So I've only been doing this for, like I said, 3 or 4 years, and I've already noticed a huge difference in the availability of equipment, the quality of the equipment, and the price is just dropping like crazy. Larger sensors with a lower read noise, higher sensitivity, and they're larger in size. They're just coming down in price. People are using CMOS sensors that are really amazing and low noise, and they can do a little bit of everything. And then what else? Yeah, I guess that's kind of it. It's a lot of fun, but be careful. It can cost you a lot of money.
All right, and then so people hopefully will start, posting questions, more detailed questions and stuff. I'll answer what I can, and then whatever I can't answer, I'll bounce over to you, Seth, and maybe you can answer them.
Yeah, you can find me. I think the easiest thing would be to let's see. You could go into my AstroBin account and message me there, and Matt can give the link. It's AstroBin. You just search for Seth Eddy, SETHEDDY.
Yeah, I'll put a link down in the description down below. So that'd be great. Awesome.
Yep.
I think that covers it, Seth. Thank you very much. And depending on how popular this is and what kind of questions we may get, maybe we'll have another interview session and get into a little bit more detail on various things that people seem to be interested in. And maybe, depending on how it's looking, I might try my hand at some of this as well, and then I can share and we can discuss and see how it goes.
One other thing, you might put this in the question, like what people might need to know too, earlier in the talk. Some of the biggest steps that I made in my photography was not gear; it was actually processing. So, when you learn a new technique for processing, it can really make a huge difference on the quality of image you have. So, capturing data is very important, and learning how to capture quality data. But then once you have that data, it's understanding how you stack it, process it, sharpening or noise reduction and those kinds of techniques, and also learning how to deal with stars so they don't just wash out the image or anything. So you'll be not only learning about how to capture the data, but eventually you'll need to get into figuring out how to process it. So.
Yeah, all the post-processing takes a lot. So, All right. Excellent. Thanks again, bro.
No
Seth.
problem.
And good luck out there. Have fun capturing more images, and maybe we'll interview again.
Yeah. Thanks, Matt.
Thanks. Bye.